Madam Chair, we are streaming live and we are recording this session and we are ready to go. Sorry for the delay.
Okay, no problem. Thank you. Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to NVTA PCAC meeting. Tonight is September 28th, 2022. In accordance with policy 26 of the Northern Virginia Transportation Authority that allows all virtual meetings, the September 28th meeting of NVTA's Planning Coordination Advisory Committee is being conducted virtually. The meeting is live streamed on YouTube and the recording will be available on NVTA's YouTube channel shortly after the meeting concludes. Okay, and I will take roll. Councilmember Salonia Miles.
Present.
Board member Takis Karantonis.
Here I am.
Supervisor Walter Alcorn.
Present.
Supervisor Sylvia Glass.
Here.
Supervisor Margaret Angela Franklin.
Present.
Councilmember Sarah Bagley. Okay. Councilmember Phil Duncan.
Yes, here.
Councilmember John Steele.
Present.
Vice Mayor Pamela Sebesky.
She's absent. I'm her alternative, Ralph Smith.
Okay. All right. Glad you're joining us. Vice Mayor Preston Banks. Councilmember Signe Fredericks.
Here.
Vice Mayor Marty Martinez. Councilmember Stanley Milan.
Present.
Okay, excellent. All right. The next thing on our agenda is the summary notes of June 22nd, 2022. Are there any changes to those minutes that anybody would like to mention? Okay, if you are in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
Okay, any opposed? Okay, excellent. Status of transaction plan update, and that's Mr. Jasper.
Yes, good evening, Maker Bear, members of the committee. Good to see you virtually. Hope everyone had a good summer recess. We're back down to business, but I guess actually we never stopped, and probably you didn't either. So this evening, we want to bring you up to speed on where we are with transaction. We're kind of in the home straight, but we're not there yet, and there's still a few important things that we've got to do along the way. So we just want to go over some brief refresher, some new material, and get your inputs as well over the next half an hour or so. Haroon, if you could advance the slides. So once again, welcome from me. Co-presenting with me this evening, my colleague Shireen Abathiri, who will address some or give you some remarks on some preliminary analysis on the public comments that we received during the public comment period. And also with us is Tom Harrington from our consultant team, Cambridge Systematics, who's going to talk to us about some of the modeling information as well. But we do want to kind of get to the end of this quickly to get your input as well. So we're going to cover, as I say, an update on progress, public comments, modeling and scenario analysis, and then next steps. Next slide, please. Thank you. So on the screen, you can see some milestones. The grayed out ones are now behind us, and there are fewer bullets ahead of us than there are behind us. But I just wanted to kind of give a general perspective on where we are. We're currently reviewing testimony from the transaction public hearing held on September 8th. And comments received during the public comment period, which ended on September 18th. This public feedback will help us to identify the need for any potential changes to the draft transaction plan and project list prior to NVTA adoption in December. And over the course of this meeting and your meeting next month, we'd like to hear any thoughts that you have on that. So potential changes may include both the need for additional analysis and identification of any opportunities to better communicate the transaction content that we already have in the draft plan. For example, we've identified that the scenario analysis work in the draft plan could be described more clearly in section 7. We've received some comments to that effect as well. In addition to this committee, we've already reached out to our other statutory committee, the Technical Advisory Committee. We're meeting with the Standing Committee, which is the Planning and Programming Committee, on Monday of next week. And we'll be talking to your staff as well during this month and next to help us accomplish any updates in the most transparent way possible. We'll also be looking to give an update to NVTA at its meeting on October 13th. Next slide, please. So I'd like to hand over for the next few slides to Shri to give you some preliminary feedback on the public comment that we've received. We are working on a more formal report, but we wanted to give you as much information as we could. So this, what you're going to see here includes a few slides which were not in the mailed out packet. They were not available at the time we mailed out the packet, but we wanted to give you the information that has kind of been processed since that time. So Shri, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Keith. Thank you, Mayor Colbert and members of the committee. As Keith said, I'll briefly go through this public engagement process. We are still working through the comments to make sure we capture all the details. So though these are much more than what we presented to the TAC, there may be more, or there may be some minor edits to these numbers and the comments too, as we work through this. As you remember, we had the public comment period from August 1st to September 18th. There was an online comment form available for people to fill in and let us know about what they think about various sections of the form, of the process, public engagement process, the ease of how to reading and understanding the plan, things like that. We had the draft plan document, the draft summary document, as well as the project list out there. These two documents become the part of transaction plan. And then in addition, we also provided the project list in a sortable format on our website, so people can slice and dice it in different ways, by jurisdiction, by mode, whichever way they want to, and look at those projects in detail. And also we provided an online interactive map, so people can see those projects visually where they are located. And many people probably will be interested to see projects that are in their neighborhood or places where they usually travel to, things like that. So, and there were several other additional information also available on our website. The plan document itself and the comment form both were available in English, Spanish, and Korean. This again, we consciously pushed out to make sure that we address to one of the core values of that we have in the plan, that is equity. So, and we also the graphic on the right side actually talking to some of the spot advertisements we do, more what I call the several, I think 4 places where our consultant team went out as for pop-up events and let people know of this opportunity, provided the link to these documents and the comment forms, and kind of especially looking at certain locations where equity population, the people who may not have otherwise known about this opportunity live or concentrate. So we try to make sure we get to those communities in addition to all the social media blades and newsletters and other things we have done. And in addition to this, during this public comment period, we also had a public hearing on September 8th, same night as authority meeting. We gave both in-person and virtual opportunities for people to comment on the plan and the process. Next slide, please. So this is again a summary. As I mentioned, these numbers might change as we finalize this report. We received about 223 comments in total, most of them through the comment form, but we also received some letters directly sent to us in emails. There were 2 comments that came via emails, and we also had the opportunity given to send us comments via voicemail, a specific phone number, and we received that too. Now, if you look at the language, though we tried to push through all different languages, we received most of the comments in English. There was 1 comment in Korean. We received 223 comments in total, but the unique commenters are 205. That means there were some people who commented more than once. We are still going through those comments to make sure that they are either to identify whether they were repetitive or they commented on 2 different aspects. We are still working through that. Now, the chart on the right side kind of explains that in a visual format, so you can see which format the people received the information about this opportunity. You can see many people heard from community or advocacy organizations, interest groups, or through the emails and our own the social media and newsletter blitz. Next slide, please. This again, we are looking at where these comments were received from. Those comments were coming from. As you can see, it's from all over the NVTA region. But specifically, if you look at the darker shades, this is a map that shows the comments, range of comments from by zip codes. So if you look at the darker colors, you can see most of the darker areas are inside the Beltway. So we received a lot more comments from that part of the region than rest of the region. There are 2 zip codes I identified here. You can see in the map too that are darkest colors. The one on the southernmost part of the region, that is 22025. This is the Four Seasons Montclair communities, which had comments, specific comments about Van Buren Road extension that is in that general area. The other one you can see is in City of Falls Church towards the top right. The comments from that particular zip code were a lot mixed. Many comments were about the bike and pedestrian projects and transit projects in supportive of those. And then there were other comments about some of the aspects that people didn't like, especially the addition of new roads. There were also a few comments, probably in single digits, from District of Columbia, Maryland, and our southern neighbors in Virginia itself. I think there was 1 comment that came from New York City or New York zip code. Next slide, please. We were trying to look through the comments and see what are the common themes that we keep seeing here. As you can see on the left side, I will not read through the actual comments, but on the left side of the table, you can see the common themes. There were a large number of comments against roadways, new roadways, or widening of existing roadways. Then there were several comments that raised concerns about environment, specifically how the plan might or might not address climate change, and what policies or programs we may want to adopt or look into. On the other hand, we also received a lot of comments that supported the transit and bike and pedestrian improvements that are in the plan. Especially there were comments, if you remember, we have a BRT network we push through. We have in this plan, specifically not only looking at some of the BRT projects that are already in the development process in the region, but we try to create a connected BRT network that not only have bus lanes, but then other supportive projects like access to those bus lanes and bus stations and transfer stations and technology projects that can support the BRT. So there were several comments that supported that idea and wanted to push further. There were also some comments about safety, which is kind of related to the first set of comments where people were mentioning the more roadways means there will be more safety issues. So that's need to be addressed, those sort of comments. There were a little bit, there are a few of the comments that said or alluded to the scenarios described in the plan that people were either not understanding it clearly or they wanted to see more description, more explanation of the scenarios. The chart on the right side, as you can see, some of those comments, as I mentioned, were suggestions of improving things or seeing differently or seeing additional things. Though most of them had specific comments, and some of them were suggestions. Next slide, please. Second, looking at these in different ways, the modes mentioned, obviously, as you saw in the previous slides, comments about roadways, transit projects, and bike and pedestrian projects. And as I showed the first set of themes, there were on the right side of the chart on the right side, you can see a lot of people who commented on the roadways had a negative impression of adding new roads or widening of the existing roads. So there were a lot of negative comments about, specifically about roadways coming through in our comments. Next slide, please. I'll probably hand it over to Keith at this point because this will relate to some of the things he will be touching upon later. Keith, do you want to take it away?
Yeah, thanks, Shri. This slide talks about transactions goals, which are looking to improve mobility, accessibility, and resiliency. And we asked in the online comment form, we asked people how they felt about the extent to which the draft plan was adequately addressing the goals that, as you probably recall, have been through quite an intense process at the committee and authority level over the course of many months last year. So we just give some example comments on the left. Again, I'm not going to read these through any detail. And on the right, you're going to see a pie chart showing whether people strongly agree or disagree with whether or not the plan achieves the goal. So it says strongly agree 7%. 7% of the respondents felt that a plan does move to achieve the goals, and so on around that chart. So not surprisingly, some of the example comments were positive, some were negative, and you can kind of read through those as they're on the screen here. I'd also like to go to the next slide, however, which kind of in a similar way asked folks how they felt about the core values for transactions. So Haroon, if you could advance to the next slide. Thanks. So the core values you recall: safety, equity, and sustainability. And again, are people agreeing that the plan is helping to achieve the core values? Strongly agree 8%, and then different shades of agreement or disagreement going around the pie chart. And again, some example comments indicating both positive and negative perspectives on how well the plan does this. For both the goals and the core values shown on this slide, I did want to just note that on the evening of the public hearing, which preceded MBTA's September meeting, at the regular business meeting that followed the public hearing, we did give a presentation on the work of the Transaction Bus Rapid Transit Planning Working Group, which had really helped shape MBTA staff thinking in terms of potential BRT projects to include in transaction. And I mentioned this because a lot of things, particularly a lot of the kind of disagreement type comments that we heard at the public hearing, and as you see through the example comments here that were submitted online, actually a regional BRT system for Northern Virginia would actually go a long way to addressing some of the concerns that have been raised by some commenters on the plan's ability to achieve its goals and to do that in a way that's consistent with the core values. So I think it's fair to say that this is extremely complex. We understand people submit the comments based on their read of the document, their perception of what the document is or isn't, and at the same time, from an MBTA perspective, we do see, as I think we've mentioned in previous meetings of this committee, that a regional BRT system for Northern Virginia will help achieve goals. It will help do that in a way that's consistent with the core values. And importantly, it kind of meets something that was identified much earlier in the process for transaction through the needs identification stage, that people, particularly outside of the kind of core central jurisdictions, like Arlington, Alexandria, City of Falls Church, people are saying to us through our various surveys that they want meaningful choices, meaningful travel choices. Metro rail extensions are often mentioned, but metro rail extensions are potentially lead times that you count in decades, not in years. And we felt that it was very important that we need to plan for metro rail extensions in the future, but we also need to plan for something in the meantime that helps give people the meaningful choices that will reduce dependency on driving alone. Next slide, please. Some comments on scenario analysis. I'll return to scenario analysis a few slides further on, but scenario analysis is where, in a very technical way, we attempt to address uncertainty associated with long-range transportation planning. Traditionally, long-range transportation planning involves the use of modeling tools to forecast travel patterns for a future, or we sometimes call it an horizon year, typically 20 or 30 years from the present day. And this time period reflects the amount of time it can take to plan, design, fund, and build major transportation infrastructure. This forecast of the future, we sometimes refer to as a standard forecast, assumes that travel behavior in the horizon year, 2 or 3 decades into the future, will look similar to the present day, albeit updated to reflect anticipated changes in population, jobs, and additions to the transportation system itself. However, societal and other factors could lead to unexpected travel behavior changes in the meantime, leading to uncertainty as to how well the standard forecast reflects what the future will actually look like. Such factors may include changing preferences or priorities, new transportation policies, and external factors largely beyond the control of national, state, regional, or local governments. The likelihood of these types of external and other factors occurring, however minor, may create uncertainty as to the reliability of the standard forecast, and consequently the usefulness of any long-range transportation plan, including transaction, is dependent on an understanding of the potential variability of the standard forecast. And all that's to say, we do scenario analysis to try and develop our understanding of the potential variability of the standard forecast. It is a very difficult concept to convey in a few paragraphs or even a few pages. And we did want to get some feedback on how well we were doing with conveying scenario analysis and the scenarios that we actually looked at. So as I say, I'll return to this in a bit more detail here, but you can see when it comes to the common themes in the left column, the percent of responses, 13%, 11%, and 10% respectively, indicates a fairly low level of response from the overall group of people who provided us with comments. So that alone is indicative that people may have washed over the scenario analysis, and as you see, the feelings on this were mixed. When it comes to specific strategies or types of projects, it was fairly evenly split between positive, negative, and neither or neutral. When it comes to scenario definition, a small number felt positive, a slightly larger number felt negative, but most didn't really have a reaction. And when it came to thoughts on future travel, 5% positive, 5% negative, and 90% felt neither way about that. So it kind of suggests that there's a lot to be done here when it comes to conveying what scenario analysis really means. And you can see in the example comments again how people felt about the scenario analysis content of transaction. Next slide. And then just to kind of round off here, we did ask people to provide feedback on specific projects. Remember, there are 429 of them in transaction, and we weren't really sure what to expect since none of these projects are actually there's any commitment to funds, unlike our 6-year program. We weren't really sure whether people would react very strongly to the project list, which ran to about 30 pages. So those 429 projects, there was a lot to absorb. And as you can see here, there were some strong feelings about a small number of projects, but for the most part, there were not that many comments on any particular project, other than the first couple on this list. Shri mentioned earlier project ID 273. You may not have specifically said that ID number, but this was the project he was referring to with the zip code in the southern part of the region, which was partially funded through our last 6-year program, attracted a lot of comment at that time and continues to attract comment, even though this is the long-range plan where there is actually no funding commitment associated with it. And as you can see, for the projects that were mentioned, other than that very first project, most of the mentions that we received were positive, and you can see what projects they were. There's a lot of Falls Church projects on that list. Next slide, please. So at this point, I'm going to hand over to Tom Harrington to kind of skim through some of the more recent modelling information that we have. We just want to give you a kind of a brief exposure to this so you can see what we've got. We're not going to dwell on it, but if there's anything you want to come back and discuss, then we'll certainly be more than happy to do that. So Tom, I'll hand over to you.
Sounds good. Good evening, everyone. I guess first we'll talk about, when we say modeling, we mean travel forecast, and these really are the basis for the transportation plan as we look out to the year 2045. Next slide. So in terms of the types of testing we did, we basically developed networks for the year 2045, starting with, again, the transaction project list has 429 projects. So we did one test where we actually put everything in together. That's what we call the build. So all the projects were in there. Everything was compared back to what we referred to as a no-build network. So that would be the projects that are already committed for the future in the region. Everything else we were doing was really the transaction project list. But we tested them all together in the build. We tested somewhere we just did it highway only and transit only. We tested packages of different types of projects together. And even for some of the larger projects, did individual project runs. And so this helped us both get the big picture on what was happening in the region and the sub-region, but also to get a feel for which projects would perform better when we look out to the year 2045 conditions. Next slide. And then just kind of to give you a high level of what we're talking about, this shows kind of change from 2017 to 2045, and then 2045 when we look at the build versus no build. A lot of change happens, as we know, between now and 2045 in terms of growth and trips. We have the region continuing to grow in both population and jobs. And so that shows up when we look at 2017 to 2045. When we sort of plug in the projects in transaction and sort of compare within year 2045, the build versus no build, you do see sort of the net impact of all these projects, an increase in transit person trips, about 12%. We also see a slight increase in vehicle miles traveled of 3.6%. Again, we're adding a lot of roadway projects. We're also adding transit and non-motorized. So collectively, this is sort of what's happening. Next. And then we also summarize these according to the transaction. We have a set of performance measures. You probably saw these a year ago when we were talking about goals and measures and weights. So when we plug in across these transaction performance measures, this gives you a sense of sort of the net impact of the entire transaction project list together collectively. So you see the first measures are related to delay. So we see a big sort of 19.5% reduction in hours of delay for auto. There's actually a slightly larger increase for hours of delay for transit person trips, people riding in transit. We also measured congestion duration, so how long congestion is occurring, where it's the hours of congestion, and that also would see a big improvement of almost 30% improvement in the hours of severe congestion. And then looking at some of the other measures, we looked also at improvements or increases in the transit person miles that are in dedicated priority right-of-way. So that could be on rail systems, but also could be in dedicated bus lanes. Improvements in accessibility, how people get to jobs. You can see that's 20% overall, and even a higher percentage if we look at people that live within equity emphasis areas in the region. Emissions are worth talking about. They're definitely linked to how much driving occurs. And so we looked at this two ways. If we looked at today's use of electric vehicles and we plugged in the numbers, it's actually a small increase, 1.7% increase in emissions, which makes sense because we said there was a little bit of an increase in vehicle miles traveled. But with some of the investments that are in transaction to improve the amount of electrification in the vehicle fleet, the numbers show it could be a reduction of 54% over the no build in terms of emissions. So that's one key thing that we looked at. And then the last measure was system redundancy. So how the system does if there's more demand. And you can see that with these investments, there's a decrease in the amount of travel, in terms of travel time because of transactions. So that was the big picture overview of what's happening across the region. Next slide. We also looked at this in a little more detail, first by sub-region. So we took the Northern Virginia region. We have central jurisdictions, which would be Alexandria and Arlington, inner suburbs, Fairfax, City of Fairfax, Falls Church, and then outer suburbs, Loudoun and Prince William County and Manassas all fall within that group. And so there are some differences in terms of what was happening in each of those areas. So on a percentage basis, actually, the outer suburbs show the biggest gain in transit trips as a percentage, which makes sense. They sort of had the biggest gain from where they're at in the no build conditions with adding all these transit projects, a number of which are located in Loudoun and Prince William counties. VMT varies a lot by subregion. So there's actually a decrease in vehicle miles traveled projected for the central jurisdictions, modest increase inner suburbs, and then a larger increase in the outer suburbs, which tracks with sort of where those roadway expansions are happening versus transit expansion. Overall, the reduction in hours of delay was actually distributed more evenly throughout the region. Okay, next slide. We've got a few maps as well, but again, just to get a sense, the one on the left is more change in highway traffic volumes when we compare the build against the no build. And so blue would be areas where there's sort of decreases in volume expected due to the investments, red where there's some increases expected due to some of the changes. And on the right, that's translated into areas with some of the shifts and delay. I think noteworthy, you do see a little more blue on some of our more congested roadways like the Beltway and I-95 corridor. So that is, again, where a lot of these improvements were focused, and you do see that show up in blue with decreases in delay. Next. The next set of maps are looking at accessibility. So in this case, the darker colors are basically an increase in the number of jobs that someone can get to within a reasonable commuting time. And so on the left, we're showing how you can get to jobs by automobile. And there we have gains really pretty spread evenly throughout the region. Definitely some areas show up a little bit stronger, particularly the Beltway corridor. You see some improvements there, Dulles corridor, out 66. On the right side, it's transit access. And here we do have some areas that have a little more focus. I think that's because kind of as you get closer in the region, we have very good transit coverage. And as you go further out, I think there were some more significant changes in terms of what's being added to the network. So you see particularly Alexandria and Prince William County kind of jumping out as areas with bigger increases in that accessibility by transit. Next. And then I mentioned we did some kind of looking at the highway projects versus transit projects. I think what's interesting here is when we look at them together, they don't appear to be competing, meaning when we look at transit ridership or transit trips, that's definitely driven by the transit projects we have in there. So when we look at the full build with which has highway and then the transit only does have a little bit more in terms of transit trips, but it's pretty close to the full build, which suggests that the highway projects aren't taking away transit ridership per se. Transit ridership is definitely linked to that transit investment. Similarly, on the roadway side, we see big impacts on person hours of delay due to the investment in some of the highway improvements that we have. So again, the full build versus the highway, you see more reduction in delay with the full build, but you do get a significant, with just the roadway projects alone, it's almost 18%. So it's very close to that number we saw with the full build. All right, next slide. Okay, I think that was it for this section. I guess I'll pause and see if there are any questions before we move on.
I have a question.
Yes.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Yes, could you explain, maybe you've said it before, but what is the full build? I'm a little fuzzy on that.
Sure. Yeah, the transaction plan includes a project list with 429 projects. And when we say full build, we mean what would happen if we tested all 429 projects together in one network.
Okay. Now, my other question is, here in Western Loudoun, we have several projects that's projected for Purcellville community. We have the 690 interchange, and we have the Mayfair Crown Drive extension from Purcellville Road to 690 interchange. Now, when these projects are considered, is there any consideration for these projects going through residential communities and the impact that it would have on those communities? Because we're having a big discussion about that currently in Purcellville.
Yep. Keith, I don't know if you want to take that one or.
Yeah, I certainly attempt to do that. In terms of the sorts of direct impacts of projects on the environment or adjacent communities and so on, transaction is being a long range plan is not really addressing that. I think it's important to state and to restate that not a single project in transaction represents a commitment to funding. Yes, that just is not part of transaction. It is a plan to look at the extent to which the needs that have been identified can be addressed by the projects that are in the plan. Whether or not any of those projects actually become funded and advance is something that's kind of more immediate, and that warrants much deeper analysis than we would get into in a long range plan for the region. I hope that answers the question.
Well, the problem with the 690 is that it's been funded already, so, and they're moving forward with it, but we've discovered that some of the route that they're going to take is going through some wetlands and is in conflict with our comp plan.
Right. Again, I think that's kind of at the detailed project engineering stage, which will be dealt with, locally through established processes. And to be honest, if a project is fully funded, it wouldn't qualify to be included in our build network. It would actually be in our base network, which we refer to as the no build, meaning these are projects that we're going to be comparing everything against, because that there's a commitment to fully fund them, so they shouldn't be in the build part of, shouldn't be included among the 429 projects if they are fully funded. But in the case of the one you specifically mentioned, I need to go back and look at the plan. It's possible if a project has got some funding but not fully funded, then it may well be an unknown bill, but I don't know the specifics off the top of my head.
Okay, well, I was looking for the project to be listed in the project list, but I didn't see it. So basically it's already approved, and no build is not part of that 429 projects.
That would sound very plausible, yeah.
Okay, all right, okay, thank you.
Okay, does anyone else have any questions?
I do.
Okay.
This is
Yeah.
Signe.
Frederick, go ahead.
Hi. So I'm first of all, I want to thank you for all this work, because it's very impressive. As you know, one of my concerns is being on target with emissions, and I see that dependent on electrification of vehicles, emissions could be reduced by up to 54% if we build everything in here. If we reduce emissions by 54%, will we be in the correct ballpark for our whatever we have committed to, or is that still not reaching our target?
I'm going to ask Tom, if I may, to kind of address what was actually modeled to accomplish that number that you mentioned, and then I'll, depending on what he says, I may come back afterwards. Tom?
Yep. Yeah, in the one slide where I showed the two numbers, both of those were testing what we call the full build, or the build with all 429 projects. The difference in the percent of emissions was really the assumption that we had a number of projects in the build list that include infrastructure to support electric vehicles. So with that investment, if we can achieve higher electric vehicle participation in the region, that's how we get to the 54% drop in emissions relative, build relative to the no build. So it's not addressing how we achieve regional goals in absolute terms. We're really just looking at what would happen to the build with the electrification relative to the no build. And so it just, again, emphasizing how important, the electrification percentage is specifically to the emissions measure.
And that leads me to ask, how many electric, or is there a percentage of electric vehicles that we need to achieve before we can reduce emissions by this 54% that you have on here? Would every single car need to be electric?
No, it's not every single car, and it varies, by the type of vehicle as well. So I think the projections are expecting, Yeah, and really, a lot of what we're doing here is also, we'll get into with scenarios. We're talking some assumptions about what's doable. I don't think anyone has the hard number, what's actually going to happen. But yeah, it's higher percent of electric vehicles for the single occupant vehicles, a little bit lower for trucks, for some bigger vehicles where you're not going to see quite as many in terms of electric. So it's kind of a mixture of the two in that,
So are you saying we didn't have a target? I mean, how would we achieve the number 54% if we don't have a target? We do have a target. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, right. I think in this one, it's part of our work at looking at, based on projections about what's likely with electrification. There are some future targets, about where we think we're going to end up. So again, just to get that relative impact. So.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for your questions. Anyone else have any questions?
Yes, Councilor. Would it be safe to say that the 54% reduction in emissions will be a combination of the electric vehicles and the VMT reduction?
Definitely those two things contribute, absolutely. In this particular slide, though, we're showing what happens under the full build scenario, which actually had a slight increase in VMT. So the decrease in emissions is really related to that electrification assumption. There are other, if we look at groups of projects, some of particularly the transit projects lead to reductions in VMT. And so in that case, you're right, it would be both the reduction in VMT and the electrification.
And the wait time, delay time also, it will be all part of that combination or calculation to reduce emissions.
Yeah, right. You're right. The vehicle hours of travel are also contribute to emissions as well.
Okay. Okay. All right. Thank you.
And we do have a little bit more to say on emissions under the scenario analysis slides, which we'll get to shortly.
Okay, excellent. Okay, I don't think, does anyone else have any questions?
Okay, let's move into the scenario analysis. If you go to the next slide, Haroon. So I mentioned before, this scenario analysis is all about dealing with uncertainty. And the reason we care about uncertainty, apart from the professional desire to know the limits of our forecasting abilities, although transaction itself does not commit any funding, that happens for our 6-year program. It is helpful to understand that if projects appear to perform well under multiple scenarios, then that does give us some confidence that investing in those projects, should they be subject to funding approval by subsequent 6-year programs, would mean that the risk of investment obsolescence, as we sometimes refer to it, basically we spend our money on something and we wouldn't, the project wouldn't reach a full economic life. That would mean that the authority didn't get the maximum it could get from its money. So this is all why we care about uncertainty, because it does have impacts on potential impacts on how money is invested in the future. So with transaction, we identified 3 scenarios that are listed here: new normal, transportation technology, and transportation policy mechanisms. That essentially is looking at the impacts of a combination of incentives and pricing to influence travel behavior. If you could go to the next slide, I just want to say, before I hand back over to Tom, is that scenario analysis is one of the more complex analytical components of transaction, and the most difficult for us to communicate in a simple but comprehensive manner. And for example, you see the standard forecast I mentioned here, and the 3 scenarios indicated by the yellow, maroon, and blue circles. The definitions for 2 of the 3 scenarios that are listed in page 20 of the draft plan document. That would be the technology and the incentives pricing scenarios. Should have mentioned that these scenarios included the assumptions related to the trip changes for the pandemic, post-pandemic new normal scenario described on the same page. But in the process of trying to communicate things, some things actually didn't get communicated that well at all. So while the scenarios could have been clarified further, and indeed scenarios are in some ways peripheral to the main analysis, the standard forecast, the outcomes remain the same from the scenarios that we put in the draft plan. So Tom, do you want to just kind of quickly take us through, perhaps thinking about what we heard recently in the Q&A on emissions, to maybe kind of get to that information to kind of explain what the scenarios told us about emissions?
Yep, next slide. So we looked at the scenarios two ways. This first slide is saying, well, what if, forget the build projects, what if we look at the no build, what happens to some of the travel performance just with these three scenarios that we're looking at? And so with the changes that are assumed, again, with scenario planning, it's not a crystal ball. We're not saying this is the one that's going to happen. It's really gives a sense of the sensitivity of, given different assumptions, what you see in terms of some of the results. And so with that post-pandemic new normal, which is when there's less trips being made because more people are at home telecommuting, as expected, we have less trips, and that equates to less delay. So delay decreasing by 15% and decreases in VMT. So again, that's totally tied to less people making those commute trips because they can telework. The technology scenario layers on that changes related to electric vehicles, but also the connected and autonomous vehicles. And so with that, we see even further improvement in terms of the decreases in delay. With some of the new technology, we're expecting that cars will flow better on roadways as the cars are equipped and the roads are equipped with new technology. And so that leads to some of the decreases in delay we see. We also have, with these connected automated vehicles, a negative impact in transit based on how we assume that some of the people that currently take transit would now have options to use some of these shared sort of, if you think of TNC companies or Uber and Lyft, have the ability to get and use some of those type services as well. In this no build, the technology scenario does include those electrification assumptions. And so just on their own, without any build projects, you see a decrease in emissions just related more to that increase of electrification in the technology scenario. And then finally, in the incentives and pricing, where we have more roads where there's pricing, we have also an assumption of free transit trips. There you see, the big increase in transit expected because we're making it free transit. We also see, some of the other decreases that we've seen with VMT and delay and severe congestion. So that kind of gives you the feel for what happens if these assumptions were in place. We can go to the next slide. But the other reason we do this isn't just to paint a picture of what the future could be, but it's also to see what happens to our projects if the future is different. So it gives us a chance to test how will the transaction projects look if the future ends up being a little different than what we called our standard forecast. And so we looked at the scenarios against the no build. So we're looking at, say, with each of these scenarios, how does the build under the scenario look against the no build under the scenario? So post-pandemic with the projects, the build projects, and post-pandemic without the projects. And that's really the change that we want to look at. So we can look at the next slide. And yeah, so why that is helpful. Let's see, I think it's the other direction. Yeah, there we go. Yeah, so on this slide where we're looking at the build projects, we also bring in the standard build forecast. And so it gives us a sense of seeing, well, under these conditions, do you get different results? And so as far as, for example, increase in transit trips are a little bit higher, as we saw under that incentives and pricing scenario, that's where you see the biggest gain in transit trips relative to the others, because that includes free transit. So that shows that the transit projects in transaction would do better if paired with the assumptions of that incentives and pricing. On congestion, we saw roughly the same impacts under the different scenarios. Again, they had some of the same assumptions about telework in them. And in the last part there, really that incentives pricing had a big impact because it affected transit trips, also included some overall reductions in VMT and so forth. So gives us a feel for how the specific assumptions about these scenarios could change how we view some of the projects and sort of under which conditions would some of the projects do better. So it gives us some more information than we would get just from the standard forecast on its own. Okay, I think that's all we had on scenarios. I guess, did we have any questions on the scenario analysis?
I have a question.
Yes.
This is Signe Friedrichs. Did any of these scenarios include weather events, or were they just the sort of the world being the way it is now? How would we work if a couple of different things changed?
Yeah, right. We did not have any weather-related impacts as part of any of the three scenarios. No.
The reason I ask that is that I'm looking at what's happening in Florida at this moment and sort of wondering, if we have more of these sorts of events and they impact us this way, how would we deal with that scenario? But obviously that's a very complicated thing to figure out. So thanks.
Madam Chair.
Sorry, I was on mute. Supervisor Alcorn, please go ahead.
I thought you were calling on me, but I wanted to make sure. Tom, this is probably a question for you or maybe for Keith. If you could go back to the previous slide where you compared, this is very helpful. I guess the bottom line that I'm trying to get my head around, just to make sure we're on the right track, is it worth it? So, regardless of the scenario that ends up coming about, we're spending tens of billions of dollars on transportation improvements, public money, and clearly, the build versus no build here. Job accessibility is better. Decrease in severe congestion, person hours delay. So if you could just summarize that, give us a quick summary why you think why we should support spending tens of billions of dollars in this process overall.
Okay. You want to go, Keith?
Let me go first. I think. Thank you for the question, Supervisor Alcorn. I think that I guess the key thing is that transaction isn't spending any money. It's providing information that potentially can help answer the question that you're raising, but it doesn't directly answer it itself. Transaction is fiscally, geographically unconstrained, which basically means we're looking across the board at the entire region and beyond, what the needs are, what projects that are in transaction could do to address those needs, to identify what those projects would cost. I think rightly you've reached the conclusion that it's really expensive and what should we or should not do. I think really, those decisions are outside of transaction. They are what follows transaction from MBTA's point of view through its 6-year program process. I think what I would say is, we want transaction to help inform that sort of decision making, but I think your question is probably more policy oriented than transportation planning oriented, but it's certainly, I would say what the analysis is pointing to is that if some of these scenarios actually come to pass, they may have an effect that completely swamps the money that could be spent on projects to accomplish something similar. But the big if here is, will those scenarios actually come to pass? And that none of us really know. Two of the scenarios, the technology and the new normal, are largely beyond our control. Maybe there's some influence, but largely beyond our control. The pricing and incentives scenario is something which can only happen through significant coordinated action by multiple layers of governments, probably. So that's something that could be controlled, but is going to be a heavy lift for the region, any region, to do. But certainly the pricing and incentive scenario does point towards being able to achieve things without spending so much money on projects, which frankly, as Ms. Backman said before, the region doesn't have that funding capacity anyway.
And if I could add on to that, there are a lot of things that are a part of this needs assessment, if you will, that the authority doesn't have control over, some of the land use. And we received a fair amount of comments regarding, oh, you didn't look at land use and things like that, even though we did take the TPB's model, and I can never remember the number, but whatever forecast that has been adopted by the TPB. But to further answer your question, Supervisor Alcorn, when you look at the estimated or projected increases in population and employment, I think if we do nothing, we really will be in a bind, because right now, this region, we are attractive. And we generally tend to bounce back. Even when the country is in an economic downturn, we bounce back a lot quicker. Of course, we have the federal government. We have all modes in this region, whether it's rail, heavy rail, commuter rail, bus rapid transit, bike ped facilities, trails. So we have a lot of things that make us attractive. So businesses want to locate here. People want to move here. But if we don't make some investments, that will level out. And will it ever be enough? Now, we get to some of the things that the authority cannot control, even with some of the incentives, and going back to what the Transportation Planning Board adopted regarding climate change. There are things that are beyond the control of the authority and the elected officials. It really does take a collective to get us there. But I do think this helps us in the decision making. Here are some things that we can do to not only help with climate change, or greenhouse gas emissions, but reducing congestion and getting improved travel times and things of that nature. The last thing I will say, because we hear this a lot, just don't build roads or don't invest in certain modes. In Northern Virginia, and I always say this, we are truly multimodal because there is no one size fit all solution when it comes to the investments needed to keep the region moving. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Backman. That's very helpful. I appreciate that.
Could I make a comment, Madam Chair?
Yes.
This is Signy again.
Yes.
To what Supervisor Alcorn just said and some of my questions, I think the fact that it's possible for us under these scenarios to decrease emissions by as much as it is possible is in itself a huge benefit, because it will not only reach our climate target, but it will also make it less likely that people will have lung problems and all kinds of other issues that are caused by emissions. So not just the emissions, but then also the decrease in congestion using alternative modes of traffic is going to pay for itself in a way as well. And I do support what Ms. Blackman is saying about keeping the area attractive, because we have been one of the areas in the country that has the worst traffic. I don't know that we're still there, but we have been. And that and the cost of housing make us very unattractive. So, you know, assuming that we do manage to decrease congestion and decrease emissions, I think, you know, we're really doing ourselves and the whole world a favor. So good question though, Mr. Alcorn.
Okay, thank you for those comments. Anyone else have any comments or questions? Okay, thank you. We can continue.
I think there was only one slide, and thank you. So you've provided us with a lot of feedback already this evening, which is exactly what we wanted to hear from you. If there are other thoughts that you have that you know, don't come to you until another day or two down the road, then by all means send them to Haroon and myself. And indeed, if Mayor Colbert doesn't mind, to route them through her, so that we can kind of, you know, finalize our thinking on the sorts of things that you know we're going to propose changing in the draft documents, you know, in the light of public comment and exactly this sort of feedback. So we're looking to finalize the draft plan in time for your endorsement in November. So next month will again not be an action evening, in the sense that we won't be asking you to make any decisions. But I think that's really like the final opportunity to kind of, you know, provide feedback, review changes before we kind of wrap up the final draft that we'll be asking you to endorse in November, so that we can go to MBTA in December for adoption of some version of transaction at that time. And as I say again, yeah, it may be we need to change content. It may be we need to better communicate the content that's in the plan. It may be that we need to look at a few more details on a few things, and almost certainly do some cleanup. You know, I don't know of any typos, but I would not be surprised if there are not one or two typos still lurking in one of those documents that we want to clean up as well. So that's kind of where we are. That's what we'll be coming back to you within in October. And you know, if there's any final thoughts that you have this evening, great. If not, we'll hand the agenda back to you.
Okay. All right. Excellent. And Ms. Bachman, do you have an NVTA update?
I will be brief, Madam Chair. Just on the next authority meeting is October the 13th. We will receive a presentation from VDOT on the status of the concessionaire funding projects as part of Transform 66 outside the Beltway. As you all are probably aware of, the section from Prince William to Fairfax, that 9-mile segment has opened. But additionally, the authority made recommendations on the $500 million concessionaire payment. So we're going to get an update on those projects and the status and when those projects will be opening. And lastly, as part of our governance and personnel committee meeting, we will be talking about our 2023 legislative agenda. I don't think there will be any surprises there when we say again, protect the revenue sources as our top priority. I think that will continue to be the top priority, but we will be coordinating with your localities to try to make sure that we are speaking as a region when it comes to the legislative program. And Madam Chair, that's all I have. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Now I know our next meeting is October 26th. We were looking at November. Do we have a date for November meeting yet?
Madam Chair, we have contemplated an earlier date than the fourth Wednesday. So it's gonna be on third Wednesday, and it is going to be a virtual meeting with a little early start time to accommodate another committee meeting. So we are thinking to start around 5 p.m. virtually.
Okay, on the 16th, that would be November 16th at 5 p.m.
Let me check the date.
Okay, okay.
Madam Chair, is that right, or is that the 23rd?
I'm looking at, I'm looking at November. So the 2nd, I thought he said the 3rd. Is that
Third.
correct?
That is the
Third,
16th.
second
Mayor
night.
Colbert, you're
Okay,
right.
great. Sorry, I heard 4th. So yeah, that's much better.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right, I think the 16th at 5 p.m. Okay. And that one will be virtual. Okay.
That's correct, Mayor.
All right. And next meeting in October, I will not be here. I will be, Vienna has its annual Halloween parade, and that's a big deal for us. So I will be there. But the vice chair, council member Sonia Miles will chair that meeting. Are there any final comments from anyone? Okay, do we have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
All right.
Second.
Okay. Have a great September, everybody.
All right, thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, Linda.
Good night.